What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rant and Review Pro Wrestling, and this is a commentary. I have seen over the last 24 hours, in addition to the terrible footage of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in my hometown collapsing overnight. Yes, I am fine, and nobody I know was hurt, and unfortunately, there are people who are missing, and we do send our prayers and thoughts out to them, obviously, because this is a local thing that affects me. But that was shocking in the real world. In our little silly world of pro wrestling and the IWC, another shocking thing came up over the social medias, and that was me seeing a lot of people saying that the Attitude Era was back. It's not. And I'm sure somebody's going to type down in the description box and all this other stuff, but look, here's the thing. And I have the benefit of being the age that I am, and I am a bit older as a wrestling fan now. But it's funny to me to see people who were either not even alive when the Attitude Era happened, or were like 6, 7, 8 years old when the Attitude Era happened, talk about how this is the Attitude Era. And it also kind of makes me understand these people have completely misconstrued what the Attitude Era was about. They think it was about curse words and blood and a lot of promos, and those were elements of the Attitude Era, but that isn't the reason why the Attitude Era was the Attitude Era. What the Attitude Era was WWF trying to counter what WCW was doing. WCW had all the big stars, which, by the way, is kind of a counterpoint to one of the things I've heard somebody say is like, well, the Attitude Era was big name stars doing big name things. No, it wasn't. In 1997, which is when the Attitude Era started in WWF, WCW had the majority of the big boys. That's why they call it where the big boys play. WWF had 3 main event guys: The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, and Bret the Hitman Hart, with Stone Cold Steve Austin on the come up. And by November, they had lost Bret Hart, so they were down to 2 main event stars and an up-and-coming star who had just had his neck broken and couldn't wrestle because he was partially paralyzed. So it wasn't looking great for the WWF in 97, and they certainly did not have all the big stars doing big angles. 98, it was basically Stone Cold. Michaels, you lost him after Mania, so it was Stone Cold and The Undertaker. Those were the 2 big main event stars, and the rest of the roster were mid-card guys. And this would last, I would say, probably up until mid-1999 by the time The Rock finally started to take off as a big major single star. He was taken off in 98, but he really didn't reach that megastar status until 99, 2000 as far as being the guy in the company. So I don't know where people get this whole the Attitude Era was about big name stars doing big name skits thing. But back to my original point and dovetailing off of this, that meant the most of the WWF's roster at the time were mid-card guys. Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Jeff Jarrett, The Rock at the time, Ken Shamrock, and so on and so forth were not main event stars. Mick Foley was not a household name. He was kind of him. And that was kind of the reaction when he was Stone Cold Steve Austin's first challenger for the world title after WrestleMania 14 in 98 was, oh, dude, love? That's okay. But they made it work because of the storyline and that really was revolving around Vince McMahon. What you had were a bunch of mid-carders who had characters that tapped into that era's subculture. And that's what the Attitude Era really was driven off of. It wasn't driven off of just because they had blood and said some bad words. It was WWF going from what had been a wrestling product that was presented as something for Saturday morning cartoons, because before the 90s, that's most of the time when you saw wrestling. Most wrestling shows took place Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, with a few exceptions being Primetime Wrestling and WCW World Championship Wrestling, or which later became WCW Saturday Night, that aired at 6 o'clock in the evening on Saturdays. But most of the time, it was not a primetime show until Monday Night Raw in 93, and even that took a while before we got to the Monday Night Wars. But the point is that the WWF was a cartoony, kind of family-friendly, family-safe product up until the mid to late 90s when they decided to change to compete with WCW. And then they went from the Saturday morning cartoon atmosphere at a time when Saturday morning cartoons were passé in the 90s and went to more of what was going on with 18 to 33-year-old males in America in the 1990s. And what was that? It was grunge rock. It was flannel. That's why you got the headbangers, even though headbangers wore flannel, so they were kind of grunge bangers, but grunge and heavy metal are not the same thing. But anyway, that's what they were going after. I mean, hell, we had D-Generation X. Again, tapping into what the current generation, the current youth culture was in the 90s by naming one of their factions practically after the name of the Generation X, but adding D-Generation in front of it to kind of get across that Jerry Springer feel, which brings up Jerry Springer and all those talk shows that were popular in the 90s. They brought that into the WWF. Even something as obscure and crazy as The Brood, who were based off, if you go back and look, there's a copyright notice on some of those old shows in 98, 99 from the WWF featuring Gangrel and The Brood. Well, Gangrel, they had to license that character from Wizards of the Coast because it came from a game called Vampire the Masquerade, which you couldn't get any nerdier and more subculture than basing a faction in wrestling and a particular character off of a nerdy goth card game from the 1990s. That's what they were doing, though. Porn stars in the 90s was the first time that they went from being these kind of taboo people you never talked about to Ron Jeremy and Jenna Jameson being mini pop culture icons. I mean, look at Baywatch, for God's sakes, and the leaked sex tape stuff that came out in the 90s. We had another porn star, Tracy Lords, was a pop star. She released an album during the 90s. And that's why you got characters like Val Venus. You got characters like The Godfather, partially because of the hip hop culture at the time. Pimps and Hoes and all of that stuff. That's what strip clubs had a resurgence in the 1990s. And that's why you had all of that TNA stuff going on in WWE, which they borrowed from ECW, who were also tapping into the same thing. And by the way, WCW tapped into it a little bit too with the Sting's Crow. Because the Crow's Sting is based off of the movie The Crow, which is based off the comic book, but in particular, Sting's character is based off of a 1994 very gothy, very 90s, very grunge rock music video movie that was popular, but it was a subculture kind of thing. They referenced South Park. The Undertaker got progressively more and more goth, 90s goth, during the Attitude Era until he left and became the American Badass. There were so many parts and places in which the WWF's Attitude Era was not about, again, just having blood and just having promos and just having people use naughty words and be cursing and everything else. It was about an attitude shift in a time from that family-friendly thing towards something that was more edgy, into something that was based off of the craziness and the wild, rebellious nature of youth culture of the 90s. That is not what we got going on today. Today, it's big time wrestling. This is the Tribal Chief era. This is the Bloodline era. This is the Triple H era. This is big time matches, TKO, UFC, putting up big stars against big stars. Again, the Attitude Era was not about big stars. It was about growing the next generation of stars, because all the big stars were in WCW already. This era is about big stars, and I think this era is done a disservice by comparing it or saying it's the second coming of the Attitude Era. It's not. It's its own era. It's its own thing. It's unique. It's kind of a combination of a lot of different prior eras. There are some Attitude Era elements to it. There's also some Ruthless Aggression era elements to it. You've got a multi-year world champion, which is something that is from a bygone era. The last time you had one was Hulk Hogan back in the 80s. This is going back to that. And you only had, a handful of other wrestlers that have been WWF champion, WWE champion for more than 1 year. The point of this is, again, I'm not trying to rag too much on people who are saying this is the Attitude Era. I just think that they're saying it because they didn't live through the Attitude Era, and their perception of the Attitude Era is through the PG rating. And because we got the PG rating, that meant the Attitude Era was over with. That's not why the Attitude Era ended. The Attitude Era ended at WrestleMania X7 in 2001 because the culture had changed, the landscape of wrestling had changed, and it was time for them to move on. But for that 4-year period of time between 1997 and 2001, what the WWF was doing was tapping in to the rebellious side of youth culture. That is a completely different thing from what they're doing now. We were talking about CEOs and all of that stuff back then, except for that Vince was the boss of the company. That's about as far as the corporate storylines went in WWF at the time. Vince was the boss. He had some stooges, and then Austin and The Rock would just embarrass him and kick his ass all over the place, and so did The Undertaker breaking his ankle. But again, this is just my opinion. Maybe you still think that right now is a recreation of the Attitude Era, and I mean, again, unless you lived through it, and you didn't live through it, I don't know what to tell you. You know, people will think what they will. But I want to know what you think in the comment box below. If you're a person who was either too young or not even born when the Attitude Era came around, do you think that this current era is Attitude Era 2.0? And for those of you who were, I would say, 15 and older when the Attitude Era started and saw the Attitude Era from start to finish, do you think right now really is like the Attitude Era? Let your voice be heard in the comment box below. Until then, I will see you guys here for more news, rumors, and commentary on the Rant and Review Pro Wrestling. Have a good day.